This is going to sound like something out of a bad Lifetime movie, but unfortunately, it's my life. I'm still processing everything, so forgive me if this is disjointed. I don't know if I'm looking for advice, validation, or just a place to scream into the void. I 35F married my husband, James 38M, 10 years ago. We met at a mutual friend's party and hit it off immediately. He was charming, funny, and had this way of making me feel like the only person in the room. I fell hard and fast, and within a year, we were married. For most of our marriage, I thought we were happy. We had a beautiful son, Ethan 8M, and built a comfortable life together. James worked in finance, and while his job could be stressful, it allowed me to stay home with Ethan, something we both agreed on when we decided to have kids. Looking back, there were red flags I ignored. James traveled a lot for work, and sometimes he'd come home later than expected with vague excuses about meetings running over or networking events. He was always attached to his phone, but I chalked it up to work. I trusted him, so I didn't pry. That trust shattered about 6 months ago. One day, Ethan was playing on James's iPad while I was cleaning up after lunch. Suddenly, he came running into the kitchen with a confused look on his face. "Mom, who's Lisa?" he asked. I froze. Lisa was not a name I recognized, and Ethan said her messages kept popping up on the screen. I told Ethan to go play in his room, then opened the messages. My heart sank. The messages were explicit. Not only was James cheating, but he'd been doing it for years. The messages went back at least 3 years, and they weren't just to Lisa. There were texts from multiple women, all of whom he'd been seeing during his business trips. I confronted James that night. At first, he denied everything, but when I showed him the messages, he finally admitted to it. His excuse? I was stressed from work, and I needed an escape. As if that made it okay. I was furious. I told him I wanted a divorce, but he begged me to stay. He promised it was over, that he'd cut off contact with everyone and go to therapy. He said he loved me and Ethan and didn't want to lose us. I didn't believe him, but for Ethan's sake, I agreed to try counseling before making a final decision. For a while, things seemed to get better. James went to therapy, started spending more time at home, and made an effort to be more involved in our lives. I was cautiously optimistic. Then everything spiraled out of control. About 2 months ago, Ethan came down with a mysterious illness. It started with mild symptoms, stomach aches, fatigue, but quickly escalated. He became lethargic, couldn't keep food down, and started losing weight rapidly. I took him to multiple doctors, but they couldn't figure out what was wrong. One night, Ethan woke up screaming in pain. I rushed him to the ER, terrified it was something life-threatening. After running a battery of tests, the doctors found traces of a toxic substance in his system. They told me it was likely ingested over time and asked if there was any chance he could have been exposed to something at home. I was confused and horrified. We don't keep anything dangerous within Ethan's reach, and I couldn't think of how he could have come into contact with poison. Then a chilling thought crossed my mind, James. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia. Despite everything, I couldn't believe the man I'd loved and built a life with could harm our son. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. James had been unusually attentive lately, especially when it came to preparing Ethan's meals. I'd thought it was him trying to make amends, but now I wasn't so sure. I decided to trust my instincts and set up a nanny cam in the kitchen. What I found made my blood run cold. The footage showed James mixing something into Ethan's food when he thought no one was watching. I took the video straight to the police, who confirmed that the substance matched what had been found in Ethan's system. James was arrested that same day. When the police arrested James, I was overwhelmed with a mix of emotions: relief that Ethan was finally safe, heartbreak over what our lives had come to, and an all-consuming rage that the man I once trusted with everything had been actively trying to harm our child. James's arrest caused a stir in our small community. We lived in one of those suburban neighborhoods where everyone knows everyone else's business, or at least they think they do. Suddenly, I was the woman with the psychopath husband, and whispers followed me everywhere I went. At first, I tried to ignore it, focusing all my energy on Ethan, but it was impossible to escape. The investigation into James's actions revealed even more than I expected. Apparently, he hadn't just been unfaithful for years, he had also been living a double life. One of the women he'd been seeing, Lisa, wasn't just some fling, she was his girlfriend. They had an apartment together in the city, and he'd been funneling money from our joint accounts to support her lifestyle. What sickened me most was learning that Lisa knew about me and Ethan. She knew James was married with a child, and she didn't care. Worse, when the police questioned her, she admitted that James had confided in her about his plan to get rid of the complications in his life. She claimed she thought he was just venting and never believed he'd actually follow through. The case against James was solid, but the legal process was grueling. The police needed my testimony, and I had to relive the entire ordeal multiple times, watching the nanny cam footage, describing Ethan's symptoms, recounting every red flag I'd ignored. Each time, it felt like ripping open a wound that had barely begun to heal. Ethan, meanwhile, was struggling to recover not just physically, but emotionally. He was old enough to sense that something was deeply wrong, even if I tried to shield him from the worst of it. At first, I told him that his dad was away for work, but that excuse only lasted so long. He started asking more questions, like why his dad hadn't called or why the neighbors were looking at us funny. Eventually, I had to tell him a version of the truth. "Your dad made some bad choices," I said carefully one night as we sat on his bed. "He hurt us, and he's not going to be around for a while." Ethan stared at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Did he hurt me on purpose?" he whispered. My heart shattered. How do you answer a question like that without breaking your child's spirit? I took his small hands in mine and promised him that I would always protect him, no matter what. But protecting Ethan was easier said than done. Despite the overwhelming evidence against James, his lawyers fought tooth and nail to get him released on bail. To my horror, the judge granted it, citing his lack of prior criminal record and his standing in the community. James was out of jail within weeks, and although there was a restraining order in place, the idea of him being free terrified me. I began noticing strange things around the house, footsteps in the snow leading up to the windows, the feeling of being watched when I walked to the car. I reported everything to the police, but there wasn't much they could do without concrete evidence that James was violating the restraining order. One night, I woke up to the sound of glass breaking. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and crept toward Ethan's room, praying he was safe. I found him sitting up in bed, clutching his stuffed dinosaur and looking terrified. I locked the door behind us and called 911. The police arrived within minutes and found James lurking in the backyard. He'd broken a window trying to get inside. This time, he was arrested for violating the restraining order, and his bail was revoked. The break-in was the final straw for me. I packed up our things and moved Ethan and me to a new city, cutting ties with anyone who might be in contact with James. I changed my phone number, deleted my social media accounts, and enrolled Ethan in a new school. Starting over wasn't easy. I struggled to find a job after being a stay-at-home mom for so long, and Ethan had a hard time adjusting to his new environment. But we had each other, and that was what mattered. Meanwhile, the trial dragged on for months. James's defense team tried to paint him as a loving father who had succumbed to the pressures of an unhappy marriage. They claimed that I was an unstable, vindictive wife who was exaggerating the situation to keep Ethan away from his father. Despite James's defense team's relentless efforts to paint him as a victim, the evidence against him was undeniable. The nanny cam footage was damning, showing him deliberately poisoning Ethan's food. Toxicology reports confirmed the substance matched what had been found in Ethan's system, and financial records revealed his purchases of the poison. But even with such strong evidence, the trial wasn't as straightforward as I'd hoped. James's lawyers were skilled, and they attacked every aspect of my character. They brought up emails and text messages from years ago, mundane marital arguments they twisted into proof that I was emotionally unstable. They claimed I'd set James up out of spite, fabricating a story to punish him for his infidelity. Sitting in the courtroom day after day was like reliving a nightmare. I hated seeing James sitting there, dressed sharply in a suit, with a smug expression on his face as his lawyers tore me apart. But I kept going for Ethan. Ethan, meanwhile, was doing his best to adjust to our new life. He missed his old friends and sometimes cried at night, asking why we had to leave. I tried my best to reassure him, to remind him that our new home was a fresh start where we could be safe. Still, the trauma lingered. He started having nightmares and was terrified of being left alone, even for a few minutes. I enrolled him in therapy and slowly, he began opening up. He talked about how scared he'd been when he was sick, how he didn't understand why his dad, someone he loved and trusted, would hurt him. Listening to him broke my heart all over again. The turning point in the trial came when Lisa, James's girlfriend, was called to testify. Up until that point, she'd been reluctant to cooperate, likely out of fear or misplaced loyalty. But when she took the stand, her demeanor shifted. She admitted that James had talked openly about his frustrations with me and Ethan, calling us obstacles to his happiness. The jury's reaction was palpable. Suddenly, James's carefully curated image of a stressed, loving father crumbled. Lisa's testimony, combined with the mountain of evidence, painted a chilling picture of a man willing to do anything, even kill his own child for his selfish desires. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than a day. James was found guilty on all counts: attempted murder, child endangerment, and violating the restraining order. When the verdict was read, I felt an overwhelming wave of relief. For the first time in months, I could breathe. James was sentenced to 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole for the first 15 years. The judge didn't mince words during sentencing, calling his actions monstrous and a heinous betrayal of trust. But even with James behind bars, the aftermath of his actions lingered. I was left to pick up the pieces of a life I no longer recognized. Ethan and I stayed in the new city, far from the memories of our old life. I found a job working for a nonprofit that helped survivors of domestic abuse and family violence. It was a way to channel my pain into something meaningful, to help others who had faced similar betrayals. Ethan began thriving in his new school. His nightmares became less frequent, and he started making friends. He still asked questions about his dad sometimes, why he did what he did, whether he was ever coming back. I answered as honestly as I could, without burdening him with details he wasn't ready for. As for me, therapy helped me unpack the years of gaslighting and manipulation I'd endured. I realized that James's betrayal didn't just begin with the poisoning, it had been building for years through his lies, infidelity, and emotional abuse. Coming to terms with that was painful, but it was also freeing. One of the hardest parts of the aftermath was dealing with the few people who still supported James. His parents, for instance, refused to believe he was guilty. They accused me of turning Ethan against his father and even tried to gain visitation rights. Thankfully, the court sided with me, but it was a reminder of how deep James's manipulations ran. Over time, I began to rebuild a sense of normalcy. I made friends in our new community, found hobbies I loved, and started focusing on my own needs for the first time in years. Ethan and I created new traditions, like movie nights and weekend hikes, little rituals that helped us feel like a family again. But healing wasn't a straight line. There were setbacks, moments of overwhelming grief or anger, times when I questioned every decision I'd made. On particularly hard days, I'd look at Ethan, at how strong and resilient he was, and remind myself that we'd survived the worst. Years later, when Ethan was a teenager, he asked to visit James in prison. I was hesitant at first, worried about reopening old wounds. But I didn't want to deny him the chance to seek closure. We arranged a supervised visit, and I sat in the waiting room, heart pounding, as Ethan went in alone. When he came out, his face was calm but resolute. He said he was sorry, Ethan told me, but I don't think he really meant it. That moment marked a turning point for both of us. Ethan had faced his fears, confronted the man who'd hurt him, and walked away stronger. As for me, I realized that while James's actions had left scars, they didn't define us. We were more than his betrayal, more than his crimes. We were survivors. Today, Ethan is a happy, confident young man with dreams of becoming a doctor. He says he wants to help kids who've been through hard times, just like he did. As for me, I've found peace in ways I never thought possible. Our life isn't perfect, but it's ours, and that's enough. To anyone reading this who might be going through something similar, know that you're stronger than you think. There's life after betrayal, after trauma, after heartbreak. It's not easy, and it doesn't happen overnight, but it's possible. And if Ethan and I can do it, so can you.